The summer evening in the small town was so tranquil that Ethan Parker could hear the rhythmic chirping of crickets echoing from the garden. He sat in his study, staring blankly at the computer screen, where the blinking cursor seemed to mock the emptiness in his mind. The room was bathed in a soft golden light, but the air felt oppressively heavy. With a deep sigh, Ethan leaned back in his chair and stood up. Ever since his book about his divorce had become a publishing phenomenon, he had grown accustomed to being pestered by reporters. But tonight he couldn't have known that his quiet life was about to be shattered by something far bigger, something he wasn't prepared for. A sudden knock at the door broke the stillness. At first Ethan thought about ignoring it, but the persistent rhythm didn't let up. Knock, knock, knock. The sound was so insistent it felt like it was hammering into his very thoughts. Hesitant, he stepped out of his study, an inexplicable unease swelling in his chest. Who would come by at this hour, so late at night? As he approached the door, he glanced at the clock on the wall. It was nearly 11 p.m. Ethan stopped at the door and peered through the peephole. A woman was standing there, her hair disheveled and her posture weary, and in the dim porch light, he almost didn't recognize her. But when her dull, tired eyes lifted, a cold, familiar chill ran down his spine. It was Amanda Gray, the woman who had once meant everything to him, but who had also destroyed his life a decade ago. She looked so worn and frail that it took Ethan a moment to convince himself it was really her. The faded dress she wore was caked with dirt, and her shoes were so tattered they looked like they had come from a nightmare. Ethan cracked the door open, his voice cutting like steel. "Amanda? What are you doing here?" Amanda's eyes locked onto his, brimming with desperation. "Ethan, please, I need your help," she rasped, her voice hoarse, as if every word was weighed down by fear and pain. "Help?" Ethan let out a bitter laugh, his lips curling into a cynical smirk. "After everything you did to me, you think I'd help you?" Amanda swayed unsteadily, clutching the doorframe for support. "I have no one else, Ethan. I have nowhere else to go." Ethan stood there, his heart caught in a storm of conflicting emotions: anger, hatred, but above all, confusion. What did she think, showing up here after all these years? Did she expect him to welcome her as if nothing had happened? But before Ethan could say anything, Amanda suddenly collapsed. She crumpled right at his doorstep, her trembling hand clutching at his ankle like a silent plea. Ethan froze, caught between shock and disdain. "Get up," he snapped, his voice sharp. "I don't want to make a scene in front of the neighbors." Amanda looked up, tears streaking down her gaunt face. "Please, Ethan. I need a place to rest, just for one night. I'll explain everything later." The door remained ajar between them, a symbol of the vast chasm their past had created. Ethan clenched his fists, standing motionless for what felt like an eternity. Finally, with a heavy sigh, he opened the door wider, his eyes filled with both exhaustion and frustration. "Come in, but don't think for a second this means I've forgiven you." Amanda staggered inside, her steps unsteady. The door shut behind her, and Ethan knew that from this moment on, the peaceful life he had carefully rebuilt over the past 10 years would never be the same again. Ethan walked into the kitchen, his gaze fixed on the woman now sitting silently at the old wooden chair by the table. Amanda had changed out of her filthy clothes into an oversized shirt of his and a loose pair of pajama pants. She looked fragile, almost swallowed up by the quiet stillness of the house. Ethan placed a cup of coffee in front of her, his voice low and cold as if to maintain a safe distance between them. "Drink this and then talk. Why are you here after all these years?" Amanda picked up the cup, her thin hands trembling so much that the coffee spilled over the edge. She looked up at Ethan, her once lively eyes now filled with sadness. "Ethan, I know you hate me, but I have nowhere else to go. No one else left." Ethan sat down across from her, folding his arms, his piercing gaze boring into her. "No one else? What about Andrew, your perfect man? You left me for him, didn't you?" Hearing Andrew's name, Amanda's face twisted in pain, as if it struck an unhealed wound. She set the cup down, her hands gripping each other as though to keep from falling apart. "Andrew left me," she said, her voice trembling, every word laced with humiliation. Ethan let out a dry laugh, his tone dripping with bitterness. "Left you? I thought he was your golden ticket, the man who was going to give you everything you wanted. Don't tell me you're here looking for pity." Amanda's lips quivered, and she lowered her head as tears slipped silently down her cheeks. "I'm not asking for pity, Ethan. I know I don't deserve it, but I didn't know where else to turn." Ethan leaned back, studying her with a mixture of contempt and curiosity. The woman before him was a ghost of the Amanda he once knew, a woman who had betrayed him without hesitation, who had chosen wealth and luxury over the life they had built together. And now, she was broken, desperate, and clinging to whatever shred of hope she thought he could offer. "What did he do to you?" Ethan asked, his voice quieter but edged with skepticism. Amanda hesitated, her body shivering as if recalling some painful memory. He became violent when everything fell apart. I tried to leave, but he threatened me. He said if I ever told anyone what I knew, he'd ruin me completely." Ethan's jaw tightened. "You knew what kind of man he was when you left me for him. But you chose him anyway." Amanda nodded, tears streaming freely now. "I did. And I was wrong, Ethan. I know that now. But I didn't come here expecting you to forgive me. I just need a place to rest. Just for a while." Ethan exhaled sharply, his mind racing. Part of him wanted to throw her out, to let her face the consequences of her choices. But as he looked into her tear-streaked face, he saw not the confident, ambitious woman who had left him, but someone who had been crushed under the weight of her own mistakes. "Fine," Ethan said at last, his voice firm. "But don't expect anything from me. You can stay for now, but don't think for a second that this changes anything." Amanda didn't reply, only nodded meekly. Ethan stood up and turned away, feeling the weight of the past pressing down on his shoulders. He knew that, from this moment, the carefully constructed walls of his life were about to be tested like never before. Amanda lifted her face, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I'm not here looking for pity, Ethan. I have no other choice. I've lost everything." Seeing her worn-down appearance, Ethan felt a surge of anger rise in his chest. He wanted to yell at her, to throw in her face that this was the price she had to pay, the consequence of her betrayal. But instead, he stayed silent, letting her continue. I thought Andrew was everything I needed," Amanda began, her voice faltering. "He had money, power. I naively believed I had found a new life, a better one. But after a while, I realized he wasn't the man I thought he was. He was cruel, greedy, and deceitful." Ethan let out a dry, bitter laugh. How ironic. A liar being deceived. Amanda didn't flinch at his cutting remark. She lowered her head, her fingers nervously twisting together. "He forced me to participate in his schemes, and when everything fell apart, I lost everything. My reputation, my money, even my dignity. And now I'm sick. I can't work. I can't stand on my own. I came here because you're the only person I could think of who might help me." Ethan felt a wave of fury churn in his chest. "Why would you think I'd help you? After everything you did, you think I'd forgive you and become your crutch?" Amanda met his gaze, her eyes filled with sorrow but steady. "No, Ethan. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I know I hurt you in ways that can't be undone, but I truly have no one else." Ethan leaned back in his chair, his eyes locked on the woman sitting before him. She had once been the person he loved most, the one he trusted more than anyone else. And she had shattered it all. She had chosen someone else over him, chosen a glittering life she believed was perfect. And now here she was, just a shadow of who she used to be. "What did he do to you?" Ethan asked, his voice low and serious. Amanda shivered slightly, as though recalling painful memories. He became violent when everything collapsed. I tried to leave, but he threatened to hurt me if I ever exposed anything. I filed for divorce but had to flee Milwaukee so he wouldn't find me. You knew what kind of man he was when you left me for him. And you still chose him, Ethan said, his voice cold and unyielding. Amanda nodded, her tears falling like silent confessions. I was wrong, Ethan. I know that now. But I didn't come here hoping for forgiveness. I just need a place to rest, just for a little while. Ethan remained silent, his thoughts spinning like a whirlwind. A part of him wanted to throw her out, to make her face the consequences of her own choices. But as he looked into her tear-filled eyes, he realized something. Amanda was no longer the confident, ambitious woman he once knew. She was now broken, lost, and desperately seeking salvation. Fine, Ethan said, his voice firm and laced with bitterness. But you won't get pity from me. You can stay here, but don't think for a second that I'll forget what you did. Amanda didn't respond, only nodded quietly. Ethan stood up, feeling as though he had just invited a storm into the fragile peace he had worked so hard to build over the past 10 years. He knew that from this moment his life would never be the same again. Later that evening, Ethan stood silently in the corner of his dark kitchen, gripping a half-empty glass of whiskey. From the living room he could hear the faint murmur of voices, Amanda's trembling, uneven tone occasionally breaking, and Clara's sharp, probing questions, her voice steady and cool like a scalpel. Amanda's words faltered and grew softer, as though she feared what might unravel if she spoke the truth too clearly. It wasn't just Andrew forcing me into those things, Amanda said, her voice cracking under the weight of her admission. I agreed to it. I knew what he was doing, but I turned a blind eye because I thought I'd be safe. Because I wanted the money. I wanted a life I thought Ethan couldn't give me. The words hit Ethan like a knife to the chest. He stepped out of the shadows, his voice cutting through the conversation like a blade. What does that mean, Amanda? Are you saying you didn't just leave me for him? You willingly became his accomplice? Amanda flinched, her eyes wide with fear as she turned to see Ethan standing there. Her lips parted as if to respond, but no words came out. Clara glanced at Ethan, then back at Amanda, her expression devoid of the sympathy she had shown earlier. Instead, her eyes were sharp, almost cold. You need to tell the whole story. No more hiding. Amanda's shoulders slumped as she took a deep, shuddering breath. Andrew said if I helped him, we'd have everything. He told me we just needed to outsmart the system a few more times, and then we could disappear with millions. I believed him. I thought I deserved that life. But when he got caught, he blamed everything on me. He threw me under the bus to save himself. Ethan's anger flared, a hot, sharp pain coursing through him. So now you're here dragging your mess into my life again? You didn't just ruin your own life, you destroyed mine too. And now you've dragged Clara into this? Amanda's head dropped, her hands trembling. I didn't mean to. You didn't mean to? Ethan's voice was sharp, his rage barely contained. Amanda, you've had every chance to do the right thing, and you waited until you had nowhere else to turn. Clara, who had been silently observing, suddenly stood, her expression hard. This isn't just about you anymore, Amanda. I've already been threatened for looking into Andrew's past. His people aren't going to let this slide. If you're still hiding anything, now is the time to come clean. Otherwise, we're all in danger. Amanda froze, her face going pale. Threatened? She whispered, her voice barely audible. Clara pulled out her phone, scrolling quickly before holding it up. On the screen was an email with the subject line, "Stop digging." Beneath it, a short, chilling message. "Don't let your life end too soon." Ethan clenched his jaw, fury bubbling beneath the surface. Amanda, you've brought this danger into my home, into Clara's life. If you're still holding back, this is your last chance. Amanda hesitated, her face stricken with guilt and fear. Slowly, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small external hard drive, placing it on the table. "This is everything. The transactions, the documents, the secrets Andrew didn't want anyone to know. I kept it, just in case I needed leverage to save myself." Clara picked up the hard drive, her eyes narrowing as she inspected it. "This could be what we need. If we turn this over to the FBI, we could finally bring Andrew and his people down." Ethan stared at the drive, then back at Amanda. "You could have done the right thing from the start, but instead you waited until there was nothing left for you to lose." Amanda's voice cracked as she replied, "I know, and I'll never be able to fix what I've done. But if this can help, I'll do whatever it takes." Ethan exhaled deeply, his anger still simmering but tempered with resignation. "I don't know if I'll ever forgive you, Amanda, but at least for once, you're doing the right thing." The room fell into a tense silence. Clara clutched the hard drive, her resolve firm. "I'll handle this, but we need to prepare for what's coming, because when they find out we have this, they won't sit idly by." Ethan watched as Clara left, her determination unwavering. Turning back to Amanda, he felt a mix of bitterness and exhaustion. "I hope you're ready, Amanda, because this time, I won't be the one standing behind you to catch you if you fall." Amanda looked up at him, her tear-streaked face full of regret. But Ethan had no more words for her. He walked out of the room, leaving her to face the consequences of her choices alone. Ethan sat silently in his living room that morning, the sunlight streaming through the cracks of the window blinds and illuminating the worn-out walls. He slumped into the old armchair, his gaze fixed on the empty space ahead, though his mind was far from still. Memories and emotions churned like a storm within him. Last night, Clara had called to share the news. Andrew Foster and his associates had been arrested following an expansive investigation triggered by the evidence Amanda had provided. The man who had wreaked havoc in so many lives would finally face justice, and his victims would get their long-overdue chance at closure. Yet Ethan felt no relief, no victory in the news. His eyes drifted to the letter on the coffee table, the one Amanda had left for him before she passed away. She had taken her final breath on a cold, somber morning in the calm quiet of a small hospital. The nurses had said there was a faint smile on her face, the kind of smile that hinted at finding peace perhaps for the first and last time in years. Ethan reached for the letter, his fingers trembling slightly as he held it. He had read it dozens of times, but no matter how many times he absorbed her words, he couldn't stop himself from reading it again. Slowly he unfolded the paper, Amanda's handwriting familiar yet fragile, as if it mirrored her own fleeting existence. "Ethan, by the time you read this, I will be gone. I'm not writing to beg for forgiveness. I know I don't deserve it. I only want you to know that I regret everything. I regret betraying the best man I ever had. I regret not seeing the value of the love you gave me. For years I lived in pain and fear, but the worst pain of all has been realizing that I destroyed everything good we once had with my own hands. I know you've endured so much because of me, and I have no right to ask anything of you anymore. But if there's one thing I can hope for, it's that you'll let go of the anger. Not for me, but for yourself. I hope you find happiness, Ethan. I hope you find someone who loves you the way I should have. With what little I have left, Amanda." Ethan folded the letter carefully, his hands still trembling. His chest felt heavy, though his eyes stayed dry. He had cried so many times over the years that the well of tears seemed to have dried up. What lingered now wasn't sadness, but an unfamiliar sense of weight lifting from within. He couldn't deny that Amanda's actions had brought ruin into his life, and that she had made choices that were impossible to erase. Yet, in her final moments, she had done something right. She had faced her mistakes. She had given him the truth. And she had, in her own way, given him the chance to free himself from the chains of resentment. That afternoon, Ethan found himself standing at Amanda's grave. The cemetery was quiet, nestled on a small hill where the wind whispered gently through the trees. A bouquet of white roses sat in his hands, their delicate petals trembling in the breeze. He stood before her gravestone, his eyes lingering on the simple inscription, Amanda Gray, a troubled soul who found peace. Ethan knelt down, placing the flowers carefully at the base of the stone. His voice was low, nearly lost in the wind. I don't know if I can forgive you, Amanda. But you were right. I can't carry this anger anymore. It's time to let it go. Thank you for reminding me of that. As he rose to his feet, the wind picked up, brushing against his face like a quiet farewell. He didn't look back as he turned away, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a faint sense of calm. The weight that had burdened him for so many years was beginning to lift. That evening, Ethan returned home and sat at his desk. For hours he stared at a blank sheet of paper, his pen resting idly in his hand. But as the clock ticked on, he felt something stir within him, an urge, a flicker of inspiration he hadn't felt in years. Slowly the words began to flow. He wasn't writing about the past anymore, nor the pain he had carried for so long. This time he wrote about hope, about forgiveness, about finding light in the darkest corners of life. The pen moved steadily across the page, and with each word, Ethan felt as though he was freeing himself from the chains of the past. Amanda's letter had been her final gift to him, not redemption for her, but a chance for him to finally move forward. For the first time in a decade, Ethan felt ready to let go. He wasn't the broken man he had been 10 years ago. He was someone new, someone standing at the threshold of a new chapter, with a lighter heart and the courage to embrace life once more. Over the years I lived in pain and fear, but what broke my heart the most was realizing that I had single-handedly destroyed everything good that we once had. I know you endured so much, and I have no right to ask anything of you anymore. But if there's one last thing I can wish for, it's that you let go of all your anger. Not for me, but for yourself. I hope you find happiness, Ethan. I hope you find someone who loves you the way I should have. With all that's left of me, Amanda. Ethan set the letter down, his eyes stinging. He didn't cry. The tears had long dried up after all those years of pain and anger. But inside him, something else began to stir, a feeling he hadn't recognized in years. It was relief. Amanda had been wrong, and her mistakes had cost them both dearly. But in her final moments, she had done one thing right. She hadn't just helped expose Andrew's crimes, she had given Ethan a chance to reevaluate himself. He couldn't deny that her letter, along with her last actions, had soothed some of the scars on his heart. That afternoon, Ethan visited Amanda's grave. The cemetery was perched on a small hill, where the wind carried the gentle scent of green grass and wildflowers. He stood before her headstone, holding a single white rose in his hand. The inscription on the stone was simple: Amanda Gray, a troubled soul who found peace. Ethan knelt, placing the rose on the soft earth. I don't know if I can forgive you, Amanda, he whispered, his voice blending with the breeze. But I won't hold on to this hate any longer. You were right. Forgiveness isn't for you. It's for me. Thank you for teaching me that final lesson. As he stood, a soft gust of wind swept past him, almost like a quiet farewell. Ethan turned and walked away, never looking back, but feeling strangely unburdened. The sun was setting behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, as if signaling the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. That evening, Ethan sat at his desk, a blank sheet of paper before him. For the first time in years, he felt an urge to write, not about the past, nor the pain he had carried. This time, he wrote about hope, about forgiveness, and about the way people, no matter how broken, could still find light in the darkness. His pen moved steadily across the page, and with each word, Ethan felt as though he was breaking free from the chains of his past. Amanda's letter had been her final gift to him, not redemption for her, but a chance for him to heal. For the first time in a decade, Ethan felt ready to let go. He was no longer the wounded man from 10 years ago. He was someone new, standing at the doorway to a new life with a heart that felt lighter and ready to love again. Amanda had made mistakes, and those mistakes had exacted a heavy toll on both of them. But in the end, she had done one thing right. She hadn't just exposed Andrew's crimes, she had also given Ethan a chance to reflect on himself. He couldn't deny that her letter, along with her final actions, had softened some of the scars on his heart. That afternoon, Ethan visited Amanda's grave. The cemetery sat on a small hill where the breeze carried the gentle scent of green grass and wildflowers. Standing before her headstone, he held a single white rose in his hand. The stone bore a simple inscription: Amanda Gray, a troubled soul who found peace. Ethan knelt and placed the rose on the soft earth. "I don't know if I've forgiven you, Amanda," he murmured, his voice blending with the wind. "But I won't hold on to this hatred any longer. You were right. Forgiveness isn't for you. It's for me. Thank you for teaching me your final lesson." As he stood, a light breeze swept past him, like a quiet, unspoken farewell. Ethan turned and walked away without looking back, but the heaviness in his heart had lifted. The setting sun dipped behind the hills, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and gold, a sign of an ending and a new beginning. That evening, Ethan sat at his desk with a blank sheet of paper in front of him. For the first time in years, he felt an urge to write, not about the past or the pain he had carried for so long. This time, he wrote about hope, about forgiveness, and about how people, no matter how deeply flawed, could still find light in the darkest corners of life. The pen glided smoothly across the page, and with each word, Ethan felt himself breaking free from the chains of his past. Amanda's letter had been her final gift, not a redemption for her, but a chance for him to heal. For the first time in a decade, Ethan felt ready to let go. He was no longer the wounded man from 10 years ago. He was someone new, standing at the threshold of a different life, with a lighter heart and the courage to love again.